evening, everyone, and welcome to Guelph Museum's Military Lecture Series. My name is Ken Irvin, and I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums. Our Military Lecture Series is in partnership with the Laurier Center for Military and Strategic Disarmament Studies. And tonight's talk by Blaine and Chiasson will be about 45 minutes, with time at the end for Blaine to answer some questions. And if you do have any questions, please send them in through our chat function on this webpage and send it to everyone. And if you do have any technical difficulties, please know that the session is being recorded and will be made available on the museum's media platforms. You're welcome to simply listen tonight, or you can participate by submitting questions that will be answered at the end of the talk. And we will be monitoring the chat window throughout the evening's lecture. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase, No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums commits to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight's lecture, Blaine Chiasson. Blaine has a BA in Russian language and history from Dalhousie University. He attended the University of Toronto, intending to take his master's in Russians. But after taking Mandarin and Chinese history, he became interested in the fate of the over 500,000 Russian immigrant population in interwar China and switched to modern Chinese history for his PhD. His thesis, Administering the Colonizer, Manchuria's Russians under Chinese Rule from 1919 to 1929, was published by UBC Press. Blaine's published articles all examine Russian imperialism in China and the Russian community in exile. Further research in the Russian Army and Beijing's ethnic Chinese Russian Orthodox community during the 1901 Boxer Rebellion has led to tonight's talk, a study of the eight-nation international occupation of Tianjin and Beijing from 1900 to 1903. Blaine is currently an associate professor in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. And I'd really like to thank you, Blaine, for joining us tonight. I'm really looking forward to your talk. I did a little backpacking through China when before I started working at the museum, and I'm really interested in finding out more about China and the intricacies of this rebellion. So I would like to turn it over to you, and thanks so much again for coming.
Thank you. Okay. So thanks everybody for attending this evening. This is actually the very first lecture I've given virtually to a larger audience. Let's hope everything goes well. And thank you, Ken and Emma, for the tech support. So I think you can see my PowerPoint up on screen. Perfect. Okay. So I knew there would be a glitch. All right. So hopefully I'll be able to keep this to the 45 minutes. So the title of my talk is A Tethered Dragon, the eight-nation occupation of Beijing and Tianjin, 1900 to 1902. And I will be speaking about how 6 of these nations actually tried to control the population of 2 Chinese cities between 1900 and 1902. A couple of images are there on the screen. The first one on the left-hand side is of Beijing, August the 28th, 1900. The Allied forces have taken over the capital of Qing, China. When I say Qing, Q-I-N-G, Qing is the last dynasty that ruled China. So when I refer to China, I'll refer to it as Qing China or the Qing Empire. It's the visit of the American embassy staff, and they have an honor guard of American troops that are leading them through the Meridian Gate. And the Meridian Gate, if anybody has ever been to the Forbidden City in Beijing, the Winter Palace of the imperial family. The Meridian Gate is 3 courtyards and gates in, and it marks actually the entrance to the most private part of the palace, where the emperor and his family actually live. So this represents the very first time that Europeans and Americans will actually gain access to the Forbidden City. And on the left-hand side is a cartoon from the British journal Puck, depicting each of the nations as animals fighting over the corpse of a Chinese dragon. The Russians are bears, the English are a lion, there's a rooster, that's France, there's an eagle, that's the United States. Germany is another kind of cranky-looking eagle. Japan is actually depicted as a cat with a knife in its mouth, and then on the other side is Italy, kind of a sleek-looking wolf with a knife in its pack. Okay, let's see if I can change the slide. Did that work? No. That worked. Okay. So I'm going to be actually talking tonight not very much about the Boxer Rebellion itself. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the events which led to the occupation of the 2 cities of Beijing and Tianjin. And I'm not going to actually go into very much detail about the military campaigns that took place outside of these 2 cities. During the Q&A, I'm happy to expand on either of those subjects. So these are 2 maps which actually led me into this topic. They're maps of occupied districts in Beijing itself, different colors for each of the Allied troops. If you see in the center, the Forbidden City, the palace area of the Qing royal family, is in white. This area was shared between the different allies because none of them could agree who would actually get control of that space. And I'm going to come back to that later. So what am I going to talk about tonight? I'm going to talk about, briefly look at the rebellion itself and what happened that brought these foreign forces to China. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sources that I use for this project, which I hope will soon, well, with the next couple of years, become a book. If any family is listening to this, they've been hearing this endlessly, but I promise the book is coming. I want to talk about the nature of this occupation, what kind of occupation it was, how the occupation played out in the 2 cities. I'm going to talk a little bit about the violence that was experienced in this occupation. It was it was an extremely violent event. I'll look a bit at tensions between the different allies, and then I'm going to conclude looking at the legacy of the occupation of North China between 1900 and 1902. I have these 2 photos up. One of the American occupation of the Philippines, which would lead to an American protectorate over the Philippines that would last until after World War II, and underneath it a photo of Canadian troops in South Africa. Both the UK and the US, and also focus on Imperial Germany, are going to use some of the tactics that they learned in China, counterinsurgency tactics, occupations of enemy territory, administration of enemy cities, and they're going to take the lessons learned to the Philippines, to South Africa, and in the German case, to what's now Namibia, what used to be called Southwest German Africa. And lastly, in the conclusion, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the occupation has affected China and what the Chinese think about it then and today. So how did I go about researching this paper and this project? I was told at the beginning I would find very, very little. And in fact, when I started to dig, I found more than I ever expected to find. The top left-hand corner is a diary of of a Chinese Christian who participated in the Boxer Rebellion along with the foreign forces. To the next of it is a memoir of a missionary who was in occupied Beijing. Next to that are military records from the Kew Archives, the National Archives of the UK in Kew. Top right-hand corner is a contemporary Chinese history called Blood Over Beijing, Xiejiang Beijing, which gives you a sense of how the Chinese today think about the occupation. Underneath that are files from the French military archives. Next to that, from the Italian military archives, and then a memoir of one of the soldiers who participated. There's a wealth of information out there, and I do have to say, this is my first time working with sources that originated with the military, and I'm going to talk a lot about the violence that these people perpetuated on China, but I have immense respect as an historian for the detailed records these people left behind. It's made my job much, much easier. So what kind of occupation was this? First of all, it's a military occupation, and military occupations are focused on controlling the local population. I also come to this project through teaching a comparative course on the occupations of Japan and Germany after the Second World War. And I've taken a lot of that, what I've learned on how those allies structured their occupation and put it towards this project. But every military occupation is about control. This is also an occupation, though, that was aimed at changing and reforming China. The Allies wanted to support the Qing government because the Qing government was actually responsible for giving the foreigners a great deal of privilege in China, economic privileges, access to Chinese raw materials, but also commercial privileges and even political privileges. I'm going to talk a lot about concessions. Concessions, for those of you who don't know, are a lease territory. Typically, the lease was 99 years, given to foreign powers in which they had complete economic and political control over large sections of coastal China. Probably the most famous concession that you may know about is Hong Kong, which was only returned to Chinese control when the lease came up in 1997. Another famous one is Shanghai. At this period, the foreigners had about 35 concessions across coastal China, and the Qing government had given them those privileges. So the foreigners wanted to support the Qing government in order to maintain their position in China post-1900. They also wanted to help the Chinese government reform, give it new policies on policing, justice, the economic administration of cities, the collection of taxes, all in their minds to help modernize the Qing government. But this was also a colonial occupation. The foreigners, the allies, the nations that were leading this occupation were not interested in doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They wanted access to the immense Chinese market. Some things never change. And their concessions were a way to get to that market. They also wanted to more efficiently tax and control the Chinese that were under foreign control. So there's an aspect of colonialism and colonial control to this occupation. I'll point out the four men on the screen. The top is the German head of the entire occupation. They decided to put all of the Allies under German control. His name was Albert von Waldersee. He was head of the occupation, and he would go on to work with German colonial forces in Africa. Underneath, to the left, General Voyant, who was the first French general sent out. He served in New Caledonia and in French Africa, and he's going to take his methods of colonial control and apply them to Beijing and to Tianjin. Next to him, Nicolas Frey, the head of French colonial troops in Africa and French Indochina, will also apply colonial tactics to ruling northern China. And underneath is General Chaffee, the head of the U.S.-China relief expedition, the 4,000 American troops that were going to serve in China for the next 2 years. Chaffee, although an admitted anti-imperialist, he disliked being in China for its colonial implications. After leaving China in late 1901, he's going to lead the American Philippines expedition, which is going to put down the Filipino counterinsurgency movement in the Philippines, establish an American territorial government in the Philippines, and putting in many of the reforms that we're going to see implemented, especially in Tianjin City. So this occupation is going to have colonial implications for further European and American movements in other parts of the world. Okay, I'm going to turn very quickly to the Boxer Rebellion itself. I'm going to go through this extremely quickly. Any questions about the Boxer Rebellion, happy to talk about it later. The Boxer Rebellion is basically a Buddhist-inspired peasant rebellion of peasants who had been displaced from their land in northern China through foreign incursions. They had an international context and a domestic context. The international context is that Qing China, the Qing court, had been gradually losing territory through concessions to different European powers. I'm going to try and use my own, I think it will work. The Russians had seized Port Arthur in 1897. The British had seized Weihai Wei, another important port, in 1898, and they had also extended their concession in Hong Kong. The French had seized Hankow and bits of Zhejiang. Germany had established a concession beachhead along with the railway in Shandong province in the German city of Qingdao. And even Italy had attempted to establish its own concession in Zhejiang and was refused. So the Qing court was gradually becoming more and more angry with foreign powers and their colonial and imperial aspirations for China. What was happening in North China? In North China, foreign missionaries had established a number of inland missions which had disrupted local society. They had taken property, torn down temples and built churches, displaced local elites, interfered with tax collecting, and basically had made themselves troublesome to the northern Chinese. The area where this rebellion will take place, Shandong in North China, had experienced 3 years of massive famines. And in response to this, and I should also mention a number of foreign-owned railways were displacing the traditional trade along the Grand Canal. So young men who had traditionally worked as porters along the Grand Canal now found themselves unemployed, jobless, and they blamed the foreigners. A new Buddhist sect arose in the north, which called itself the Yihe Tuan. That's the Chinese name. It refers to their martial arts exercises they would do to sort of cultivate their spirit. If any of you are familiar with Qigong or Tai Chi, the kind of pushing exercises that derive from the Chinese martial arts, the boxers had similar practices. And the reason they're called boxers is the foreigners, mostly missionaries who saw them doing this, would call them boxers that looked like they were boxing. The Boxers begin to attack foreign missions in North China, beginning first with Chinese Christians, moving on to German Catholic missionaries, finally attacking and killing a number of English missionaries. By 1898, there is a pronounced Boxer presence in the capital, Beijing. At the same time, 10,000 Qing troops have arrived in Beijing, and these are anti-foreign troops. The Qing army was divided. Some were pro-foreign, some were anti-foreign. But the dominant Qing troops in Beijing were anti-foreign. The missionaries who are now pouring into Beijing and moving into the diplomatic compound in Beijing ask permission for more troops. The ruler, the Dowager Empress, agrees, and a number of Japanese Marines arrive. Boxers begin to attack Christians on the streets of Beijing. On the 12th of July, a Japanese diplomat is killed by an anti-foreign general. On the 13th, the next day, a German diplomat kills supposedly a young Boxer in the embassy quarter of Beijing. He may have actually been there selling food. It's unclear. Anyway, he kills this young man. The foreign powers call on their reinforcements in Beijing, in Tianjin. The British Admiral Seymour begins to head to Beijing and is turned back. June the 20th, the same diplomat, Clements von Kettel, who had killed that young boy 7 days before, foolhardily, by himself, rides out into the streets of Beijing saying he's going to attack Boxers, and he is surrounded and killed. And on June the 21st, the leader of China, the Dowager Empress, says there's a state of war against the foreigners. And for the next 55 days, the area of Beijing where the foreigners lived, it was called the legation quarters, think of it as the diplomatic headquarters, was under siege. It was surrounded by a wall. There was about 500 armed soldiers. There was another 3,000 people resident in the legation quarters, about 1,000 foreigners, men, women, and children, and about 2,000 Chinese, mostly Christian. The fighting is not continuous. The fighting is actually pretty sporadic. Weeks go by with no fighting. And in fact, several times the Dowager Empress sends food into the legation quarters to feed the foreigners. So there's this odd relationship between the Qing court and what's going on. I can talk more about that in the question and answer period if you want. By the middle of July, an international force made up of 8 armies, the US, Great Britain, Germany, Russia, Austria, France, Italy, and Japan, are moving from Tianjin to Beijing. They take Tianjin very quickly. End of July, beginning of August, they begin to move towards Beijing. August the 15th, the siege is lifted. The day before, the court flees to the west, and Beijing is now going to be occupied for the next 6 months. The court will not return to Beijing until January 1902, when the Boxer Protocol, the document that ended the event, is signed. The Boxer Protocol is going to lay on Qing China an indemnity. If you don't know what an indemnity is the money that you pay for the privilege of having been beaten. They lay an indemnity of 450,000 taels, which works out to $61 billion in 1981 currency, an immense amount of money, which is going to immiserate the Qing Empire. So let's turn to the occupation itself. This is Beijing. Beijing was divided into different sectors. The Russian sectors were later taken over by the Germans. The Germans arrived rather late. The Germans didn't participate in any of the initial fighting that liberated Tianjin and Beijing. They arrived on the 11th of October, 1900. But Waldersee, because he was made head of the occupation government, insisted that the Germans be given part of the city. The occupation in Beijing was primarily a police occupation. The foreigners were most interested in controlling and restoring order to the city. But because of the extreme violence in the German and the Russian and the French borders, I'm going to come back to this later, in fact, it's only going to be the US, the United Kingdom, and the Japanese districts of Beijing that are restored to order the most quickly. All of the sources talk about the fact that the Japanese have the best run and most peaceful concession, followed by the United States and the United Kingdom, and the rest of the concessions were virtually deserted because of the violence that was experienced by the local population against the soldiers who controlled those parts of Beijing. One Chinese source I read said the only people living in the German and Russian and French concessions were dogs, because everyone else had fled to the concessions controlled by Japan, the US, and the UK. The sources also speak that economic life returned very quickly to the Japanese, the US, and the UK concession districts of Beijing, and they did not return to the other sections until well into the fall of 1900. Now you can see the center of it, it says shared. This is actually the imperial city, 3 cities in one, the largest palace complex in the world, which was had a joint administration by all of the allies. The Americans, who were the first to reach the imperial city in August 1900, were prevented by the Russians from entering the final gate into the cities. General Chaffee, in his own diary, said when he received the Russian delegation that told him he could not enter the imperial city, he spoke to them in language that did not befit a general. The imperial city was the prize. It was probably the wealthiest part of Beijing, and all of the powers wanted it. And the very fact that they were forced to share it out, I think, actually preserved the imperial city intact. And I'm going to come back to that later. The first thing that the occupation powers wished to do was destroy the walls of Beijing. Beijing had walls 60 feet high and wide enough for 3 lanes of cars to drive on them. They were some of the most beautiful and famous city walls in the world. And it was decided that they would be destroyed. But the task was simply too much for the occupation powers. So it was decided then that the Indian sappers, the military men, and most of the British forces in China, with the exception of the officer class, were Indian because they were brought over from the Indian British colony Indian. It was agreed that Bombay sappers, who were experts in tunneling and blowing things up, would breach the walls in several places so that the city could no longer be defended against an outside force. There was another reason they got the Indians to do this. It was determined that because the Indians were not white, they could not they could not stay overnight within the city itself and had to stay outside the city walls. So blowing up the walls, parts of the walls, would allow them to be able to go back and forth easily. The British-owned railway system, which to this point had not been allowed to enter Beijing because the walls were considered sacred, used this opportunity to extend its line into Beijing itself. Don't know if you can see it, but this is the new line here. It breaks through the first wall into what was called the Chinese city, and then it comes up here and it breaks through the second wall into the city that was reserved for the Manchus, the ruling class, the ruling elite who governed China. And in this way, too, the walls lost some of their kind of sacred power to the Chinese through being broken. The walls did survive until the late 1950s, and then Mao Zedong finished the job, blowing them up to replace them with a subway line. This is the Temple of Heaven and Agriculture. It was where the British and the Americans had their headquarters, one of those sacred spaces in Beijing. Also a space, even to this day, with large open parkland, which the British and the Americans used to play polo. The Temple of Heaven, where the emperor would go to initiate the rites for the agricultural year, was one of the most sacred spaces in Beijing. The Americans used the building to store dynamite. Later, when the Italians took over the Temple of Heaven districts before turning it back over to the Chinese, they were blamed for housing this dynamite in the Temple of Heaven. There was a lot of back and forth in the Italian and the American and the English documents about whose fault it actually was and what would happen if the dynamite went off. It was predicted that if the Temple of Heaven was destroyed, the Chinese people themselves would rise up in revenge. But luckily, they got the dynamite out. As an aside, I found out about this through work in the Italian military archives in Rome when I stumbled on a file that said dynamite in the Temple of Heaven, which my friend who I was staying with in Rome remarked sounded a lot like the name of a 1970s Italian porn film. So that's Beijing, primarily a police occupation. Tianjin was a much more reformist occupation. Tianjin was a city of commerce, of merchants, a city that had a long-established merchant government, that is Chinese-controlled government. It also was a city where there had been 4 leased concessions already established: Russian, German, English, and Japanese on the outskirts. It was a city that had resisted the foreign powers, and once Tianjin was taken over, the Chinese city itself, I think you can see it there, it's a small square, the walled city controlled by the Chinese, was placed under a foreign-controlled government called the Tianjin Provisional Government, and it would rule Tianjin from July 1900 to August 1902. The government had 2 different levels. First of all, there were, and both of these levels sat in on all the council. First of all, there were generals who represented each of the military powers. At first, it was just Russia, Japan, the UK, because those were the 3 powers that had, quote-unquote, liberated Tianjin in August 1900. France complained bitterly, and once General Valdezy arrives to take over the headquarters in Beijing, Valdezy insisted that both France, Italy, and a German, I forgot to put it on the PowerPoint, but a German be added to the council. Underneath the council were department heads. These were civilians. Most of them were men who had long been resident in China. That is, they're foreigners, but there have been foreigners who have been living in China for a long time. They had expertise in Chinese law. They had expertise in Chinese policing, taxation. Many of them spoke perfect Chinese. They could read and write Chinese. One of them had a Chinese spouse. So these men were hired for their specific skills, and they ran the new departments of health and public works, police, justice, treasury, and what was called the Chinese secretary. The Chinese secretary was an American who had been born in China, spoke perfect Chinese, and he was sort of the liaison with the remaining agencies of the Chinese government. What were these? Tianjin was divided into districts. Traditionally, it was divided into different neighborhoods Each of these neighborhoods had a headman, a Chinese man who was in charge of collecting taxes, administering justice. These were kept. So in a way, the Tianjin Provisional Government is a hybrid government between foreigners and the Chinese. And it extended its jurisdiction extended only to the walls of Tianjin itself. So these foreign concessions, German, Russian, English, Japanese, they still ruled themselves. The Tianjin Provisional Council could not force them to do anything. And there's going to be a lot of tension over the next 2 years between the Tianjin Provisional Government, who's working for the Chinese, and the foreign concessions, who are working for the foreign powers. What else should I say? This is a real reformist government. It was dedicated to changing and reforming Tianjin, to making Tianjin a more efficient city, a more lucrative city. And again, I look at this because Tianjin, traditionally having been a merchant commercial city, long interacting with the foreign powers, it was willing to accept, well, they had no choice, but it was willing to accept changes in order to increase efficiency and especially economic activity. So the Tianjin Provisional Government immediately begins to reform taxation. They reform Chinese law, although they kept existing Chinese law. They begin to, they clean up the streets. They install new waterworks. They begin to pave the streets. They're going to tear down the walls. We'll talk about that in a minute. They institute a new police force. At first, the police force was made up only of foreigners from each of the military powers. The Germans were the most, with 200. The French had, I think, 150. The Americans had 100. The Italians had about 30. Later, when these men are called away by their officers and sent off to other parts of China or to Beijing, they're replaced with Chinese policemen under the police head, Colonel Mockler. The police were also tasked with cleaning up the, I guess, the morals of Tianjin. Tianjin was a big center of brothels in a section of Tianjin called Tianjin North. The sources endlessly complaining about Tianjin North and the problems with foreigners hanging out in these brothels. The Tianjin Provisional Government decided to keep the brothels, but legislate them and run them more efficiently. One thing they couldn't take was the same-sex brothels, the quote-unquote sodomite brothels, their words, not mine. These were closed down, except these brothels immediately moved outside the city walls and reopened. I guess the boys in Tianjin and the foreign forces needed what they needed. The Tianjin Provisional Government also tore down the city wall and replaced it with boulevards. They tore it down in order to protect, in order to make sure that Tianjin would never again be able to defend itself against the foreign powers. But also, city walls are symbols of a city under the special administration of the emperor, and in tearing them down, it was a punishment. They created a new waterworks in Tianjin. On one side of the screen, you can see the traditional water carrier. On the other side, the new Tianjin waterworks. They completed they started 2 bridges across the Heiho River, which were then completed by the Chinese government that took over in 1902 after the foreigners gave up the Tianjin Provisional Government and returned it to Chinese control. So I see Tianjin as an example of cooperation between the foreigners and the Chinese. One of the biggest things they did is they actually straightened out the river itself. The river was the river was only about, if you went directly from the coast to Tianjin, it was about 36 miles, or excuse me, 36 miles. But because of all the bends in the river, it was actually 56. And the river itself was very shallow and couldn't support ships with a deep, deep draw. Over the next 4 years, the provisional government and then the Chinese government that takes over after them literally straighten out and dredge the Heiho River in order that bigger ships can get to Tianjin and more money can be made. So that's the Tianjin provisional government. I want to turn now to the extreme violence in the occupation. What it really comes off the pages, the murders, the daily executions, whole villages burned, slaughter, rape. It's hard to estimate how many died, but I would actually say I estimate close to 400,000 people were killed by the foreigners over 2 years. Why was it so violent? I think it was so violent because on one hand, there was no clear end to the fighting. The fighting, when the court retreated, the boxers disappeared and took off their uniforms and blended into the local population. There was no peace treaty because actually there was no real declaration of war. So there was no sense of who was an enemy and who was an ally. And in this case, the foreign troops just decided to attack and kill any Chinese who opposed to them. When it comes to this, I see the occupation of Beijing and Tianjin and the surrounding countryside very much as a counterinsurgency, very much like Vietnam, say, in the 1950s and the 1960s, completely unlike Germany and Japan after World War II. I think race had a lot to do with it too. This was a racist time. These people barely saw the Chinese as human. They admired elite Chinese. They thought the ordinary Chinese were little better than animals. They used to tie the men had long queues, a Chinese haircut, a sort of long pigtail in the back. They would often, just for a joke, tie their queues together. They would often beat people up in the street, attack women. I think because they felt a certain amount of racial and cultural superiority, they felt capable of doing this. I'll have to quickly hurry this up. And the other thing is revenge. The foreigners have been told that the boxers were brutes, murdering innocent missionaries and women and children in China. The foreign press was full of examples of boxers killing foreigners, and I think this created a real sense of hatred among the foreign troops. There's a lot of rape. It's much reported in the ordinary newspapers and the Chinese sources, and it's rarely prosecuted. In the military sources, there's almost no prosecutions of rape of Chinese women. The only example I could find were 2 or 3 in the Americans and some in the Italians. Why? It's interesting to compare the British court-martials for rape across the same period, because the British were active in South Africa, and all the records were kept in the same book. When I looked at these records, lots of prosecutions in South Africa against British men raping Afrikaner women, that is, white women, but none in China. So I could only speculate that because these women were Chinese, their rapes were not prosecuted. Anybody picked up was often beheaded and shot. So as I said before, probably about 400,000 died. Foreigners simply took up a lot of space in China. They ran down the streets. They pushed people out of the way in marketplaces. They took things in the marketplace, and they did not pay for them. I think what we see here is an example of, it's a military occupation, but it's also people who feel that because of who they are and the race and the culture they are, they simply felt capable of doing anything they wanted in China. Quickly going to turn to looting. I'll probably have to rush through this because I don't think I'm out of time. This is Sarah Conger. She's the wife of the ambassador of China. She was trapped in the legations for 55 days. The second day Beijing was liberated, she ran 5 miles up the road into the Forbidden City, and she filled her arms with anything she could steal. Silks, jewelry, robes. She admitted this herself in her autobiography, Letters from China. And she later sold the goods because she felt so bad about stealing them. Sarah Conger, I think, is an example of the mass looting that took place in Beijing and Tianjin. Beijing was a very rich city. It was a center of a very large art market. The imperial family and the Chinese elite had huge art collections, and all of these were laid open to the foreigners when they arrived in Beijing. On the right-hand side, you can see the foreign troops arriving at the imperial silk and fur stores, taking down the doors and stealing the goods. The foreigners knew what they were doing was wrong. Most of these powers had signed a number of international agreements which prohibited the looting of private property and the sale of private property, but these were simply ignored. The various generals did try to cover up the looting through the sale of goods, in the legations, and then taking the money and dividing it up among the soldiers. Here's a slide with an auction taking place in Beijing. Over the last few years, a number of goods that were stolen in the occupation of Beijing and Tianjin have come up for auction. If any of you have any family that were in China, I would check what you have in your attic. The most amazing one is this one here, one vase which sold for $85.9 million a few years ago. The foreigners became so good, well, they were so obsessed with getting material that they even learned to read the reign names on the bottom of vases. They taught themselves what the characters meant for the different emperors in order to be able to steal the best material. This is the Astronomy of Beijing, built by the Beijing Jesuits. It was removed to Potsdam in 1901 by the Germans and returned to Beijing after World War I. Foreigners were fascinated with penetrating the imperial palaces. They wanted to see what had been kept out of foreign view for literally 1,000 years. So for the next 2 years, foreign elites are going to stream through the Forbidden City, many of them taking small objects when they were there, sitting themselves on the throne room of the emperor, and generally treating the Forbidden City as what it's going to later become, a tourist site. Between the Allies themselves, there's a great deal of tension. Once the occupation itself settled down, the Allies immediately began to fall out. The sources are full of conflict between the different soldiers, many ending up in gunfight on the streets of Beijing and Tianjin, a number of deaths. All of the different foreigners basically had pejorative words for one another. The Germans were considered the most rigid, the Russians were called barbarians, the French were considered vain, the English were considered a bit snobby, the Americans were considered by all to be a little bit uncultured, and the poor Italians, who were nicknamed the macaronis, were considered terribly inefficient. So to conclude, and sorry, I've gone about 8 minutes over, sorry again, what's the legacy of the occupation? Well, out of the occupation came the last gasp of Qing reform. The Qing court, faced with the power of the foreigners, but also seeing the good things, especially the good things that have been done in the Tianjin provisional government, decided to embark on a large-scale reform of China. Everything was changed over the next 10 years. Taxation, education, the military, and what we're going to see coming out of this is, excuse the typo, a complete militarization of China and the Chinese, and also a sense of panic that the empire is just going to be completely taken over by the foreigners. The occupation is going to lead to endless tensions between the Russians and the Japanese. The Russians are going to occupy all of Manchuria. The Japanese also see Manchuria as their own, and this will eventually lead to the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. I touched on this, but these counterinsurgency methods of extreme violence, but also of urban renovation and reform, are going to be taken to German Africa and the American-controlled Philippines. And for the Chinese themselves, there's a deep feeling of humiliation and anger. This is Chiasson. Chiasson was a German speaker. He was employed by Baldersee in the occupation. His diaries are full of impotent rage against the foreigners. Next to him is Li Hongzhang, a reformist, a Mandarin, a Chinese official, somebody who admired the foreigners, but whose own diaries are filled with a great deal of anger against the occupation. Just lately, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, in a speech, has called the Canadians the kind of running dogs of the Americans, and saying they're just like the Canadians who served the British in the occupation of Beijing and Tianjin over 100 years ago. So in the end, the occupation itself, although it brought a great deal of reform to the two city governments and a great deal of change to the two cities, is remembered in the cities themselves and in China as a traumatic event, and an event which the foreigners themselves really have not remembered. Foreigners at the time didn't believe they were doing anything terribly out of place. I'm going to end with this quote from the Peking and the Tianjin Times, which says, we've only killed a few Chinese. We've only taken a bit of loot. We've only occupied one city, but you know, it would have been worse if it had been the Boxers, which left a deeply bitter taste with the Chinese. And I'm going to end it here, and apologies for going over time.
Well, that's great. I don't think we minded all you going over time. It was really interesting, Blaine. So we do have a few questions, and hopefully we can ask you a bunch of them.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang around.
A couple of them. Do you think the rebellion has impacted China's foreign policy today?
Yes, it has. China's foreign policy today and the way the Chinese see the outside world has been affected by not just the Boxer Rebellion, but what's called by the Chinese the Century of Humiliation. It begins in 1850 with the First Opium War. It ends with the Second World War, and when the foreigners are finally forced out of China and lose their concession rights. So the occupation and the Boxer Rebellion is considered part of that long century of humiliation. Remember, from the Chinese perspective, you know, they were the center of the world up to 1850, and then all of a sudden, in 100 years, it all went to hell. And the whole kind of raison d'etre of every Chinese government, Republican and communist since then, has been to recapture that sense of China as a world power at whatever cost, and always looking at the foreign power, at the outside world, as looking to hold China back.
Oh, that's great. Is there very much interest in your research in Russia, in China?
There is, a lot of the Chinese work on the occupation. I have to say, a lot of it, especially in mainland China, in communist China, is not that great because they tend to blame everything that happened on the foreigners. I didn't go into it, but Boxer's alluded to. Boxer's murdered a lot of people, but nothing on the scale of the foreign powers. And I guess the positive reformist aspects of the occupation, these are not dealt with at all in mainland China. They are in Hong Kong and Taiwan, but not in mainland China. That said, there is a lot of interest in it, but interesting enough, the Chinese government officials who have contacted me want to get a hold of the lists of loot that I have from soldiers' letters, and I haven't turned that information over yet.
But that's another question I have is there any push by China to repatriate all the things that were stolen?
Oh yeah. There's a few years ago, the Chinese government asked the British and the French government to return all of the stolen artworks from both the First and Second Opium War and the Boxer Rebellion. In Great Britain itself, a good part of the collection is owned by the British royal family, and Her Majesty politely declined. But that's why these things, when they come up for auction, go for such enormous prices, because there's a competition among wealthy Chinese to buy these things and then give them back to the state. Then they usually end up in the Forbidden City Museum in Beijing.
Do you know if much of it is in museums, or is it a lot of it in private hands?
Some of it is museums. Some of it are there's a lot of private museums in China, wealthy Chinese who own their own museums, but they're open to the public. And with the codicil that eventually all of these goods will be given to the Chinese government itself. I've seen a couple of these collections in Shanghai, and they're pretty incredible. Although just a couple of years ago, there was a display at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto of sort of everyday goods of the Dowager Empress in the Forbidden City. And a number of goods were identified as having been looted in the Boxer Rebellion and then bought by what was called patriotic Chinese and returned to the motherland.
Okay. Another question, how did the so-called civilized nations justify the violence of the rebellion?
Right. It depends on who you look. It depends on what audience and who was doing the speaking. The military felt they didn't have to justify anything, and when they did get pushback for violence, and the pushback came in the form of missionaries who were reporting in the press of France, Great Britain, the United States, even Germany, what was happening in areas under foreign control. The military records talk about how these people should be quieted, and that what's happening in China is it's simply acceptable. There's a lot of comment on looting, and a lot of criticism of the foreign powers in the foreign press on looting. I find it interesting. There's more talk in the foreign press about the looting than there is about the blood being shed of Chinese people. I don't know what that says. I have to think more about it. But it's the looting that gets the attention of the Chinese press, although a number of missionaries did publish pretty damning accounts of what was happening to ordinary Chinese.
In relation to the missionaries, were there more missionaries after the rebellion, or were there fewer? Like, did people want to go there after they heard about this?
Yeah, paradoxically, missionary activity in North China increased. Before the Boxer Rebellion, missionary activity was somewhat curtailed. For example, they couldn't open schools, they couldn't open hospitals. The Boxer Protocol allows foreign religions free reign. So after 1900, the missionaries begin to open schools, universities, hospitals. In fact, all of the top universities and hospitals today in China were founded by foreign missionaries. They don't often acknowledge it, but they were. So I didn't go into it, but this was also, a byproduct of the Boxer Rebellion. And the Chinese people themselves have, they see it two sides. On one hand, they see the impact of foreign colonialism. On the other hand, they admire these institutions for modernizing China, and they admire these missionaries for modernizing China. That said, the number of actual converts stayed pretty flat. So Chinese tended to attend these institutions for the knowledge that they got, but they tended not to convert.
Okay, I've got one or two more questions. And one was, how were they able to pay the indemnity that was put on them, like the billions of dollars?
The short answer is foreign banks lined up to loan them the money. And in some cases, foreign powers lined up to loan them the money. A couple of the powers, first the United States, then France, then the UK, allowed a portion of the Boxer indemnity to be turned into an education fund. That is, it could be invested in schools in China, or it can be invested in scholarships to send Chinese to foreign universities. And many of the big names in 20th century Chinese history, including Deng Xiaoping, if you know him, end up going to Europe and the United States on foreign Boxer indemnity scholarships. Now, in World War I, the Chinese Republic, the Qing are gone, the Chinese Republic enthusiastically embraced the war against Germany. I think partially because of what Germany did to them in the Boxer Rebellion, and because of that, the portion that they paid to Germany, which was the largest, was canceled. After the Russian Revolution, the Russian portion was canceled. The French commuted all of it to an educational fund midway through the 20s. The United States did it by the end of the 20s, but the Chinese government was still paying the Boxer indemnity right up to the outbreak of World War II, and they made it a condition of being an ally that the Boxer indemnity be canceled, and it was in 41, I believe.
Wow. Okay, and the last question I have is, how many languages do you speak? Your sources are really varied in so many different languages.
I was lucky enough to be brought up with English and French, so I speak and read English and French. My dad's Francophone, my mom's Anglophone. I did German along with Russian at Dalhousie, although my German is so poor now, I'm going to have to get somebody to help me with the translations. I took Russian, and then I took Chinese, and so I can read those, but keeping up with it is a lot of work. I had to get a friend of mine, Eva Quattrini, I think she's tuning in tonight. Big thanks to her. She translated the Italian documents for me.
Wow, so it's a lot of work. I'm amazed by the sources that you have and the variety of them. So that's incredible. The research you've done into this. It
just keeps metastasizing. I have to shut it down at some point and actually write the damn book.
Well, I look forward to reading it. So I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's been fascinating. I've learned so much, really thought-provoking. And I want to let everyone know that this talk has been recorded. So if you want to go back and pick up some of what Blaine has said, you can watch it again. I also want to let people know that next month our lecture is on March 25th, and it's by Heather Ellis, and she's talking on hidden scars, uncovering the lived experience of shell-shocked ex-servicemen of the Great War. And that's also at 7 o'clock, so I think that'll be another great lecture. And I also let all our viewers know that the museum is open to the public. We are open now with regular hours. We recommend that you book ahead if you want to come. Go online, you can book at your spot to come in. You can come in, just drop in, but we prefer you book a spot. We have limited numbers that we can allow in. And we do have a couple exhibits you may want to check out that are military related. We have two on the Second World War. One is on the liberation of Holland, focusing on Trooper Clarence Oliver James. And the other is on Captain John Kenneth McAllister, called Scholar, Soldier, Spy. And he has a fascinating story that every Guelphite should know. So hopefully you get to see you at the museum to join us for those great exhibits, or we'll see you next month at our next lecture. And thank you again, Blaine, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.